Hi, everyone on call. I'm honored to present J Sai Deepak, a distinguished personality with a multifaceted background. He hails from Hyderabad, India, and he's established um, himself a very dedicated following, and he's a very acclaimed litigator, and is also renowned for his authorship of the India Bharat series. Mr. Deepak is an alumnus of Anna University, where he earned his bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering. He further pursued law at the Rajiv Gandhi School of Intellectual Property Law at IIT Kharagpur. His legal acumen finds expression in his practice before the Supreme Court and the High Court of Delhi. His litigation prowess is evident in several land cases in India. He gained prominence for his representation of cases concerning the entry of women to the Sabarimala temple, where he put forth the argument that the Hindu deity Ayyappan, that he adhered to Nastika Brahmacharya, which means lifelong celibacy. And his legal expertise also shone through when he represented the Travancore royal family in their bid to manage the estate of the Padmanabha Swami temple in Thiruvananthapuram.
Beyond his legal pursuits, Mr. Deepak is a prolific writer and an engaging public speaker. And he's penned numerous books on Hindu philosophy and law, and regularly contributes to the columns of the Indian Express and First Post. His intellectual curiosity, I think, extends to blogging with one blog named Yukti, focusing on constitutional theory and legal philosophy, and another named The Demanding Mistress, delving into civil, commercial, and intellectual property law. Mr. Deepak's contribution have left an indelible mark on the field of law and have significantly enriched intellectual discourse in India. His unwavering dedication to his profession and his steadfast commitment to justice underscore his prominence in the field of law.
So, Mr. Deepak, I guess we can start with what made you switch careers from mechanical engineering to law? Was being a lawyer something you had considered before you embarked on your journey with engineering?
I'm happy to be part of the speaker series at Berkeley. I'm grateful to the organizers for actually pursuing this persistently. So to answer your question, law certainly never featured in my list of career choices ever. I come from a city where the top choices are IIT, IIT, IIT. That's it. And for engineering specifically. So law was never even remotely one of the choices. In fact, I was keen on pursuing a master's or rather a career in aerospace engineering, which is why I chose mechanical engineering in my undergrad. And the hope was that I would pursue a master's. By the time I reached, I think, the 5th semester, I was clear that perhaps my future lay in engaging with the public at some point, although that is a tall order for an introvert. It just so happens that I was clear that I wasn't going to limit myself to being a private citizen, or at the very least, not someone who's going to limit himself to nuts and bolts of it, literally speaking. And around that period, I think there were quite a few tectonic developments at the national level. And since my college campus was fairly politically active, or at least the atmosphere was politically aware, if not active, I wanted to see if I had the skill sets to contribute to this national discourse one way or the other by acquiring specific training. Now, there's been an established trend of engineers taking up civil services. So the civil services examination was certainly one of my choices, but it just so happens that I don't think I would have survived the system given my degree of candor and outspokenness. So that's one of the reasons that I had to look for alternative choices. And I think in the 6th semester of my engineering, I had gone to IIT Kharagpur to present a paper at the Industrial Engineering Department, which was when we were informed that from 2006, IIT Kharagpur was going to start a program in law, specialization in intellectual property rights. So that gave me an opportunity to understand the skeletal structure of the system. What is it that I would acquire as skill sets by way of training? And when I realized that I could perhaps do a good job of straddling both the avatars as an engineer as well as a litigator, and ease my way into constitutional law, which was the ultimate goal in the first place, I decided to jump into the program. That was the switch. And more importantly, I think it was important for me to understand the architecture of the system and the way it functions. And I didn't think there was a better program than the legal program or the law program to understand that. It gives you, according to me, a ringside view of how the system operates and what are the considerations for delivering what we call justice or dispensing justice. So that was the motivation. And I'm happy I made the switch because I think I'm in the right profession. At least that's been my experience so far. And this is not based on any track record. It just so happens that each day in the profession I enjoy it thoroughly. So for me, each day matters, and I try to make each day. So hence the choice.
Very good, very good. And do you think that your roots in engineering give you an edge in law? Would you say you take more of a scientific approach to law when you're constructing arguments in case or advocating for certain?
So I think each stream of undergraduation gives you a certain specific set of skills that you bring to the table as part of the LB, also known as the JD program in your part of the world. And I think there are two sets of law programs in India, rather in Bharat. The first is the 5-year integrated program, wherein you have students largely from the humanities background. Then you have the 3-year program, which attracts a lot more diversity in terms of people coming with different qualifications and different thought processes. I think what the engineering background does is that it gives you a problem solution approach. And contrary to popular perception, the practice of the law is less about rhetoric and more about reason. And there is obviously a certain degree of rigor that is expected in the way you present arguments and the way you marshal evidence to substantiate your position. And I don't know if it's easier for an engineer to make that argument or to adopt to that particular approach or adapt to that particular approach, but I certainly benefited from it significantly. And I would say that in the current day and age, it's no more possible for a lawyer to stay away from numbers and scientific issues because increasingly you have technology pervading every aspect of practice. So obviously, the lack of fear of numbers or science in general has made it easier for me to take up a diverse array of subjects. But in general, I think the insistence on facts and coming to the point without beating around the bush is something that I would attribute to two things. One is my nature, and second, my training as an engineer, both of which have contributed significantly to the manner in which I've taken to the law.
Right now, if I may ask, when we look up your name, J Sai Deepak on Google, the first few things that show up are the cases that you've participated in around, one was around legalization of same-sex marriage, another was the marital rape exception case. So for our audience, could you give some context on these cases in a few sentences and why you might think these are the first things that pop up when we look up your name online?
So I think this July, I completed 14 years in the profession. And the first 7 years were spent in building my reputation as a civil commercial litigator, which means my areas of practice primarily are populated by intellectual property law, competition law, which you might know as antitrust law, and insolvency laws. So I'm a civil commercial litigator. That's been my primary identity for 14 years. It just so happens that until 2016, I was part of a law firm. I quit as an associate partner to set up practice as an arguing counsel. People who don't know what an arguing counsel does, it's in the mold of a barrister, wherein you don't draft or file, you're engaged by solicitors or other lawyers to argue for them and their clients in the court. Okay, so the divide between a barrister and a solicitor is the barrister argues or advocates, and the solicitor is the one who prepares the case. So the actual client is the client of the solicitor, whereas the solicitor is the client for the barrister. Okay, so that's the equation. So from being someone who drafted, filed, and argued, I switched to let's say a place in the value chain where I exclusively argued. Now, when I went independent, obviously I was at greater liberty to take up a wider array of cases. So by 2016 June, I had already established a reputation for myself as someone who could argue. And quite a few people were interested by then in engaging me in constitutional matters. It just so happens that the Sabarimala matter had just about then surfaced and had picked up steam before the Supreme Court. It's interesting because an anonymous Twitter handle who I ultimately met, and the person revealed his identity, was the one to recommend my name to this organization which was seeking representation before the Supreme Court of the Sabarimala. That's how the opportunity actually came about. And so when they reached out, I was more than happy to take the case because it gave me an opportunity from a professional perspective to showcase my knowledge of constitutional law, or at least whatever little I know of it, in the Supreme Court. And two, I felt that it was a fantastic opportunity of convergence of multiple subjects. One is faith, the second is culture, the third is law, how they meet, and how are they supposed to be understood in a legal sense. That's the opportunity that I felt was important, because it would require you to understand the institution's practices. It would require you to understand the peculiar nature of Hindu faith system, and also how do you fit that within the four corners of the law. That was an interesting challenge, and so I took it up. Plus, of course, the personal reason happens to be that I'm a believer of the deity. I've been to the institution when I was a 13-year-old, observing the 41-day fast or the vow, whatever they call it. And I've done the entire trek of 62 kilometers. So I know what it takes to complete the journey. So I wanted to defend it, and I certainly wanted to present it. So usually in the legal profession, it so happens that when people see you in action, each opportunity leads to a word of mouth reputation being built around you, and that leads to further opportunities. Sometimes those opportunities are of the same mold, and sometimes they're of a diverse mold. So while I continue to practice as a civil commercial litigator, which even today, as of today, remains about 85 to 90% of my practice volume, the rest of the 10% I chose to dedicate it to pro bono commitments towards those causes which I felt dearly about. And that's how these opportunities came about. That's been the journey. Now, it so happens that obviously some of these matters have a tendency to hog headlines. And so obviously when you Google, the algorithm, I think, is such that the most popular cases are the ones that are searched for often, are the ones that turn up. But if you ask members of my fraternity, they'll tell you that I'm primarily known for civil commercial litigation, with obviously more than passing interest in constitutional law. For the rest of the lay world, the non-legal world, their entry portal into my career happens to be these cases, the constitutional cases, which obviously hog the headlines. But I've tried to keep both the worlds apart because the skill sets that I bring to bear on each of these worlds is slightly different. The approach has to be different. The demands are different and the considerations are different. So I suspect that it is the audience which is at this point driving the perception surrounding me as a lawyer. But beyond that, I see myself primarily as a commercial litigator who also practices constitution. That's the split in my head.
Right. So you mentioned how you found a sense of interest in some of these cases, which is I essentially decided to take them up. And this is really a question I generally ask whenever I meet lawyers, because I'm curious how your personal ideologies come into play when you choose who to represent in court or what cases to take up. And additionally, like, have there been situations that you've encountered where you had to, let's say, present arguments that seemingly diverged from positions you've taken in prior cases, or are there any ideological differences there?
So the one thing that the training of a lawyer teaches you is to keep an open mind as much as possible and be extremely conscious and aware of your own ideological biases, to know how to use them and to also to know how to keep them at bay if necessary. So sometimes it so happens that you may represent an entity whose broader position and stance you may not agree with, ideologically speaking, but whose specific position on a specific issue you may agree with. Okay. So then it's less about representing an institution on an institutional position and more about representing an institution on a specific subject. It is an issue-based approach. Okay. And which is one of the reasons that while people assume that my leanings or my ideological slant is towards a particular political party of India, my position has always been issue-based. So I'll give you a simple example. Given my public perception today, or the public's perception of me today, people wouldn't have expected me to represent an organization such as the Greenpeace. Okay, I represented Greenpeace as part of my previous stint at the law firm in a free speech related issue, where the subject was how does one balance or strike a balance between constitutionally guaranteed fundamental rights of free speech and private interests protected by intellectual property rights. So you can search this up. It's called Tata versus Greenpeace, Tata Sons versus Greenpeace. It's a judgment delivered, in fact, a landmark judgment delivered by the Delhi High Court on the 28th of January 2011. And if you go through the judgment, you will realize that you would find me batting for Greenpeace. Similarly, given what the public thinks of me, they wouldn't have expected me to bat for legalization of marijuana. Okay, so there is, in fact, petition pending before the Delhi High Court, where I've asked for a slightly more liberal approach, not for recreational use, but at least for the purposes of research, for the purposes of other uses, because the overall approach of Indian legal framework to this particular product is heavily influenced by the global movement against marijuana, which was initiated under the leadership of the United States in the 1980s. Until then, it was not illegal. In fact, in the 1890s, the British undertook a huge survey because they wanted to ask if they wanted to clamp down on marijuana fully and prohibit its use in all forms. It's called the Indian Drug Hemp Commission report. And they came to the conclusion that the use of this particular substance is widespread for religious and recreational uses in this country. And so they decided that it's best not to eliminate or prohibit, but to regulate it. Okay. So citing that report, an entity wanted me to represent it before the Delhi High Court to challenge the existing strict controls over the use of the substance. So I'm associated with that litigation as well. So considering that, I think I can say this confidently that my professional choices represent diversity and by and large are not reflective of my ideological biases. But there are certain specific instances or specific cases that I've taken up precisely because I believe in those causes or I believe in those institutions and practices. So it's possible for me to play both sides in terms of arguments because that's the training of a lawyer. You're expected to be comfortable with the pro as well as the con of the argument because you never know which opportunity lands on your table. As I say often, lawyers, regardless of their signs, are fundamentally Geminis. So they have two faces. They're expected to be comfortable with both arguments. And one of the things that you're expected to do as part of your legal training is to inhabit an argument before you dismiss it. You have to step into the shoes of an argument, make sense of it. Even if you wish to dismiss it or if you wish to counter it, you need to step into that shoes, feel the argument, and then come out and say, I still reject it for these reasons. So that's, I think, the long and short.
Right.
Yeah. So you mentioned an interest in and the prominence of constitutional issues. Now, coming to the Constitution of India, this is something that we've heard you be vocal about in the past. So, what is something you would say, or what are certain issues you would mention that you believe to be shortcomings of the current version of the Constitution? Are there certain amendments that you would like to make outside of the fundamental rights and duties of Indian citizens?
So, had you asked me this question perhaps before 2020, I would have presented a far more confident answer. But with greater research and with more writing and with more reading, I've come to the conclusion that the document's history, not just the document, its history needs to be understood better. And that's one of the reasons that I chose to start writing the book series. It's more of a personal learning exercise than an engagement with the rest of the world through the book. So the one thing that I'm confident of holding forth as on date where I stand based on my reading is that the document obviously has a deep colonial imprint. Okay. Not just the bare bones of it in terms of the provisions and the sources of each of those provisions, but also the thought that went behind it, the political, religious, legal thought that went behind it. It clearly is the product of a Protestant Reformation inspired colonial exercise. And that is visible in several crucial provisions of the Constitution that have an impact on the state's identity as well as its approach to institutions and the Bharatiya identity, so to speak. So, for instance, a civilization that celebrates dharma, I would have expected its constitution to at least reflect the use of dharma as one of the policy metrics. But the word is not to be found anywhere. The debates in the Constituent Assembly prior to the drafting, or let's say the framing of the Constitution, reveal that there were some members of the Constitution who were interested in using dharma as the yardstick to judge the concept of public morality. Okay. So while the word public morality features in the Constitution expressly, it's possible to argue that the understanding of public morality is underpinned by the civilizational understanding of dharma. However, this argument that I make is still a very tentative argument. I don't wish to present it as a final position. I will be in a much better position to present my diagnosis of this document by the time I'm done with this erstwhile trilogy, and right now I would call it a tetralogy because it's a 4-part series. And I hope to conclude it by 2025, which is the 75th year of the Bharatiya Republic. So my answer would be that there is a clear Eurocentric hand which animates and pervades the document. And therefore, the question is, how much of the document is Eurocentric and how much of the document draws from our civilizational ethos is something that I'd like to understand better. And hopefully, I'd be in a much better position to answer this question by the end of 2025.
Looking forward to that answer.
Also, if I may ask a follow-up question on that, this is actually something I looked into as well, wherein the argument again that state and religion are different entities, which is reflected, as you said, in the Constitution, but the ideological basis around that, I think, was that India being a very diverse country in terms of cultures, religions, and dharma in general. So isn't it important to differentiate state, law, and religion when it comes to that, considering you're handling a country that has so much of it?
I will have to present an ideological response, and which is that I don't think Bharat has ever needed a constitution to encourage or preserve its diversity. Because after all, the earliest version of the Eurocentric constitution that we have is of 1919, not before that, right? And so we have had 3 versions: the 1919 Government of India Act, followed by the Government of India Act of 1935, then the Indian Independence Act of 1947, followed by the Constitution of 1950. And even until then, we were perfectly comfortable with internal diversity and external diversity, which is diversity which is inherent to us as a society, as a people, as an Islamic civilization. And we have also welcomed people from the outside. I consciously refrain from using the word outsiders. I'm saying people from the outside. Okay. So I don't think there was any need on the part of framers of the Constitution to embrace this, what I call the half-baked version of secularism, because frankly speaking, even European jurisdictions, when they speak of secularism and separation of the church from the state, they don't call for an irreligious state which has no identity of its own. Otherwise, why would you have monarchies as well as state churches to which the European state, or let's say European republics, owe their allegiance? The Anglican Church, when it comes to the United Kingdom, and Netherlands for that matter, Sweden for that matter, the so-called Scandinavian countries, which are seen as benchmarks for what should be a developed society today, right? So I don't think separation of the church from the state requires a society to give up its identity in the context of a society that has suffered multiple waves of invasions and colonization, with its own religion and its faith system or its way of life being the primary focus of attack, or the epicenters of attack, I would have expected the Bharatiya state, the Indian Republic, to use the document to protect native identities, not through ethnicity, not through ethnocentrism, but in terms of faith systems and ways of life, and also keep the door open for diversity. It's possible to do both. I don't need to give up one for the other. They are not mutually exclusive. It's not a zero-sum game. After all, when we chose to embrace the Jews in, I would say, the 70 Common Era, there was no constitution to speak of, right? And when the Parsis were forced to seek refuge after the Arab conquest of Persia, and they came to Bharat, there was no constitution to speak of. So what governed us then was the public barometer, the internal moral barometer, which we have always had as a civilization, which operates both at the societal level as a filter as well as at the personal level as a filter. India is one of those few countries where I would say that a diversity training is of no consequence, it's of no use, because we have grown up with diversity being part of our childhoods. I don't need to need somebody else, and certainly not from the West, to come and tell me that this is how you're supposed to respect other cultures. We know it. You don't need to teach us, right? So I genuinely believe that the separation of dharma from the state has operated to the detriment of our faith systems, of our native faith systems. And I repeat, this is not driven by race, because Bharat does not believe in race. It believes in consciousness. That's the distinction between a Eurocentric approach and a Bharatiya approach. And the unfortunate reality is that when you get uber liberal or hyper liberal, pardon me for using this politically loaded term or ideologically loaded term, you lose your sense of identity, you lose your sense of self, and in the process, the lines are completely blurred. And when that happens, the basic, natural, and legitimate instinct of preserving the self in all forms is completely lost. That works as much as at the individual level as it does at the state level. And I think what we are witnessing right now throughout the West is the implosion of the self and the loss of identity of the self across the board. There's nothing wrong in having an identity of your own and also saying, while I'm comfortable in my skin, I have no problems accommodating you within my home, provided I don't lose the right to call this my home in the first place. That argument applies, and that is perfectly valid. It's not at all wrong to say.
Right. Thank you for that clarification.
So moving on, so you talked about this Eurocentric version of the Constitution and how kind of Western mindsets are feeding into the Indian ethos, kind of. And so this question is kind of related to the language used to describe India. Do you think that India, Bharat, Hindustan represent different versions of the country? And do you think that the origins and the context behind those terms affect the public perception when using a certain term?
So I think there are a few stereotypical versions as to the history of India or the use of India. And there are other versions. So let me try and place all three versions before you, and then you choose which one you think is the right one. The standard argument presented is that since the Indus River has defined the identity of Bharat, different variants which partake from the name Indus have resulted in India. And because the Persians couldn't speak of Sindhu or couldn't pronounce Sindhu, and therefore it became Hindu, that's one version. The other lesser known version is that there is a Vedic, let's say, religious sacrifice, so to speak, which results in creation of what they call the Hindu, or I think it's a Vedic procedure which relates to the Somayag, or the worship of the moon god. Okay, so there are references, and I've heard quite a few historians speak of it and also document this particular. So that particular society, whose high culture is defined by the performance of this Vedic ritual, is known as the Hindu civilization, and that's where the word comes from, is the other version of it. The third version is, of course, references to Megasthenes and his works on Bharat called Indica, where they say that this word comes from. Regardless of it, there are two ways of looking at the issue of naming. What have we called ourselves, and what has the rest of the world called us? When I choose to name myself, I'm not going to be fettered or limited by what the rest of the world has called me. I'm going to call myself what I've always called myself, and I've always called myself Bharat. Okay. So the fact that India also has a racial history or a racist history, or the origin of the term has a racist history, is something that I've expressly dealt with as part of the first book. Okay. Citing authors such as Sylvia Wynter and others say that when the European colonizer went about his colonization exercise, and he was looking for a semblance of a religion in heathens and the colonized societies, his naming of those societies was based on their complexion. If they were dark, then the word Indios was used. Okay. So whatever may be my reasons for using India, his reason for using India was less, or had less to do with Indus Valley civilization, had less to do with Indica, but had more to do with my complexion as a dark-skinned people. And so Indios it morphs, or it transforms to India. There is some literature to this effect as well. In any case, regardless of what he has called me or what he has thought of me, the fact remains that my documents, my scripture, my founding documents, my founding civilizational and scriptural documents such as the Vedas have called me Bharat, Bharatvarsha, where we have struck a distinction between Jambudvip being the larger landmass within which Bharatvarsha as a cultural or a civilizational entity is located, within which you have Bharat as the identified political entity with very clear geographical borders, namely from the Himalayas to the ocean. That is something that we have specifically identified. And the best part is, these documents also feature as part of our discussions and cogitations in the Constituent Assembly when Article 1 of the Indian Constitution was being deliberated upon, when they chose to adopt India, that is Bharat. So it is, my only disagreement is, why would a country suffer from a multiple personality disorder wherein it straddles between the word ascribed to it, or the name ascribed to it by the colonizer, and the word it has always used for itself? I'd say go with Bharat. Why do you want India that is Bharat? Right? So that's been my larger position. And this is not driven by xenophobia. This is not driven by isolationism, where I'm saying let's cut ourselves off from the rest of the world and stop engaging with the rest of the world. A self-confident civilization must have the ability to retain its identity and at the same time engage with the rest of the world, because it says, I can hold my own on any subject, and I'm happy to learn from others if I believe that there is something that I'm not aware of. That's the Upanishadic way. But that doesn't mean I'm going to say I'm fundamentally ignorant, please come and enlighten me. I don't need the civilizing mission and the civilizing attitude towards me. We are not a 5,000-year-old civilization. We are thousands of years old, much more than 5,000 years old. Okay, so we don't need others to come and teach us the basics of living or to civilize us, but we are happy to understand the fact that there may be certain aspects of human activity where we have a lot more to learn from others. There's nothing wrong with it. Humility doesn't mean that you deprecate yourself.
Right. So I guess talking about colonization, this is something I think that applies to a lot of the students on the meeting right now. So essentially, what are your thoughts on the increasing number of young Indians like us going to Western countries for their education? Like, does it somehow feed into the colonial mindset that you talk about? Or I'm curious to know your thoughts on this, essentially, given that ancient India had a thriving exchange of culture, education, and trade with the rest of the world, including European countries.
See, just because the past was great doesn't mean that the present too is great. We are inheritors of a great civilization, but have we risen up to our past standards, or have we established ourselves fully in all spheres? The answer is a clear, resounding no. There's a long way to go, right? So I'm not going to hold it against anyone who wants to pursue an advanced degree in any other country. Then there are two options. You either settle in your adopted homeland, or you acquire those skill sets and come back to help make Bharat a better place, right? Now, should you choose to go with the second option, it's a relatively easier situation to address, because obviously you come back for multiple reasons, either because the family is here, or you feel a cultural bonding, or you feel that Bharat is the place to be because this is the next big growth story. Multiple reasons. Right? But should you actually choose to settle in your adopted homeland, the question is, how do you then do justice to your adopted identity and the identity that you're born with? That is perhaps the trickier question to answer. I know of enough Bharatiyas who have completely assimilated into Western societies to the extent that they don't wish to have anything to do with Bharat at all. They don't see themselves as Bharatiyas at all in any way. Okay? That's an individual choice that they've made. But hopefully, in the times to come, they will realize they may have assimilated into the local society, and they may have started thinking of themselves as, let's say, natural citizens of that society. But when push comes to shove, I think they will be awakened rudely when they will be reminded increasingly of the fact that you may have embraced us, but we have not embraced you fully because we still retain a sense of nativity. Okay. Unfortunately, I think what people mistake or conflate citizenship with is nativity. That is the unfortunate reality. And I don't mean by that a race-based nativity. In some places, it's race-based, and in some place, it's religion-based, and in some place, perhaps it's largely culture-based. Okay. So I genuinely hope that if the West has truly embraced the concept of diversity, people are not identified on the basis of their places of origin. Okay. But that again works in a slightly different way as far as I'm concerned, which is if more and more people leave the Indian subcontinent or the Bharatiya subcontinent in search of greener pastures, and they choose to settle outside, to the extent of assimilating fully into those societies, then what happens to our culture? And it's equally true that whether we like it or not, at the very least, some of the finest brains that we have produced as a society on our tax expense and spending our resources are leaving this space. That doesn't bode well for the society, either from an economic perspective or a cultural perspective, because we obviously need the finest of our brains for economics as well as for preservation of culture. That's how we have operated, right? I don't think it's an easy question to answer for two reasons, because it is an unfortunate reality that a communal sense, that is, the sense of belonging as part of a community, is currently at severe loggerheads with individualism. So people see themselves as individual units, and therefore their decisions are driven by their own desires, their own economic aspirations. And coupled with the fact that a colonized society suffers significant institutional degradation, its ability to retain its let's say its fabric as a community is significantly weakened, unless it has worked after colonization heavily towards rebuilding its sense of community. My biggest grouse with the Indian state post 1947 is that the post-independent, or let's say post-colonization Indian state has doubled down on the colonizers' exercise of breaking our community's sense of community, so to speak. It has worked heavily towards it, thanks to its inherited colonial wisdom and its lack of original indigenous native thinking. If you choose to look at your own institutions through the prism of the colonizer, then you're bound to see nothing of value in it. And so you break it down, citing patriarchy, you break it down fully, citing, let's use the B word, the Brahminical oppression word. You break it down, citing the jati word or the caste word or the varna word. Okay. Then once that is done, the first thing that it does in terms of a first order effect is to take away any sense of pride that you could have in your culture and its institutions. Once that is done, you're bound to look for avenues to run away as far as possible from that identity. And if there is an economic incentive which is added to it, then really speaking, what is it that you have to hold on to? Nothing. You have no reason to hold on to your culture. So when you go to the West and you see the infrastructure, when you see the quality of life, you're bound to assume, thanks to the education that you've received in your own home country, that the development or the material development that you see in the West is a direct product of its cultural advancement. And since I come from a culturally regressive position, I need to give it up. This is one of those specific examples where you see a direct relationship between culture and economics. They never operate in silos. They've never operated in silos. Every independent economic decision that every individual makes has a larger, direct, perhaps long-term second-order bearing on your cultural identity. That's a fact. At the very least, the logic of it is clear. So the problem, I think, is with those communities which go with a sense of inferiority and therefore are much more open to assimilation. So there I will not blame the West, because the West is doing what it needs to. So the problem then is with the education system of the homeland and the family system of the homeland, and our inability to impart those values and to give them the confidence that we may have our flaws, but we don't need to convert culturally or religiously or otherwise. So I could perhaps make the argument, and perhaps the immodest argument, that my public engagements are in this direction, to infuse a certain sense of confidence, but not jingoism, and certainly not to make the argument that everything that has ever existed in the world has always come from us. I'm not going to make that argument ever. But I'm certainly going to make the argument that if at all there is ever an honest assessment made of our contributions to the larger global pool of human thought, we have contributed significantly. We have made very positive contributions. We have made significant contributions, which unfortunately the West is yet to recognize. I'm not looking for validation from the West, but I'm looking for acknowledgement from the West that it has benefited from us. There's a difference between seeking validation and seeking acknowledgement of our contributions.
If I may, so you mentioned this kind of overshadowing of Vedic traditions and Vedic knowledge being passed down by this kind of assimilation into the Western mindset. How would you say that the philosophical debates within Vedic texts, such as the Vedanta, the Upanishads, the idea of the Brahman, which is the ultimate truth, and the interconnectedness of reality, how do you think concepts like those, which have been around for centuries and even millennia, how do you think they hold up today? And do you think they can still be applied in aspects of everyday life?
Allow me to say this, and I hope to not offend sentiments, but if they do, I don't care. So let me make the statement bluntly. The Western model is hyper-materialistic. The Middle Eastern model is hyper-sensory. The Bharatiya model actually says dharma, artha, kama, moksha. Everything is possible, and you strike a balance. Okay, so it's important to know where you draw the line between need and desire, and what is the consequence of transgressing those limits on the people around you. So I'm not going to put myself in a situation where I have to choose between capitalism and communism. Both of them, according to me, have emanated from the West. I reject both, because one effectively functions exclusively on market forces, and therefore we are being told that individual will is supreme. And the other focuses on hypersocial control, where there is no room for individual creativity, and it's a stifling, suffocating atmosphere to be a part of. So I don't think it's possible to subscribe to either of these models. If the literature says anything, post 1989, societies like Bharatiya societies have had to revisit their position on why are we stuck in this crossfire between these two power blocks, between these two ideologies. As a civilization which has a lot more to offer, why haven't I drawn from the ocean of my own pool of thought? I believe that more and more educated, enlightened people are obviously gravitating towards the Vedantic Vedic position, because the wheel is being reinvented, according to me. We are not learning anything new. We are relearning what we always knew. And we are unlearning what we have learned so far. Please tell me that you don't find more and more people in your part of the world understanding the value of organic products out of a blue. Why are you suddenly interested in organic products when mass-produced products have dictated the course of your economy for about a century or so? You're realizing what you have done to nature in the process of pushing for hyper mass consumerism. I'm not here to celebrate poverty. Look around me. I don't celebrate poverty. Okay. But I certainly know that you cross the line, you're penny wise and pound foolish. Pardon me for partaking from a colonial adage here, because in the long run, nature will respond. And when nature responds, it hits reset. So you don't need to protect nature. You need to protect yourself from nature's wrath. That's the first lesson that a dharmic civilization has to offer. There is no dharma without prakriti. And there's a decent chance that I may be restating George Carlin's famous statement on nature. That you are nothing to protect nature. You're nobody to protect nature. You're insects in front of nature. If nature chooses to unleash itself, you have no response at all. You have disaster management techniques, none of which will work. Right? And nature does not work in linear equations. It is heavily nonlinear. Which means if you hope to make sense of, let's use the other problematic word, climate change, using linear terms, you're going to struggle to wrap your head around it. What do you make of all the changes that you witness at the micro level or as well as at the macro level over the decades? Are you telling me that human activity has not contributed to it adversely in any way at all? How is this even possible? That's because you've ultimately treated nature as a resource, as an asset. From human resource, it's a natural resource. That's it. Everybody is a resource. And you come out with, let's say, beautiful sounding jargon like sustainable development. Sustainable development doesn't look at protecting nature. It looks at continuing to use nature at a sustainable pace. And there's a reason for it, because nature-based communities and nature protection communities have been displaced. And when you do that, those communities which have cracked the code of preserving nature over thousands of years have been replaced by people who see nature exclusively as an industrial resource. Tell me that doesn't have an impact on forest cover. That doesn't have an impact on rains. That doesn't have an impact on global precipitation. That doesn't have an impact on water availability. Of course it has. I'm sure that these are super specialized, hyper scientific subjects. But tell me that common sense has no place in these subjects. And I will keep my mouth shut. So I think somewhere it's important to do some plain speaking. I'm not going to be dragged in the extremes at all. One bit, my apologies. Those are my 3 dogs shouting. So it's important for us to draw deep from our own original thought in order for us to present these options. Okay, let's look at it from a slightly different perspective. I'm not going to make a civilizational supremacist argument to say we have all the answers. But at the very least, I would say it's time that we consider other perspectives. We have given communism and capitalism their opportunities to prove themselves, and both of them have proven to be destructive in different ways, but the net outcome being the same. Perhaps it's time to reconsider and recalibrate. After all, if the West is truly a worshipper of diversity, it should welcome diverse thought, particularly when it doesn't seem to have the answers to all the questions that are facing it. Next.
Okay, I think for the purpose of time, because we're nearing I think we're a little short in time. We can start using questions that the audience had. Some of them were in the RSVP form, so I think we can start with those ones. So this question was by Dave Pradhan. He asks, how do you envision a developed India?
First of all, um, I would hope that our metrics and definition of development are different, and that we don't follow the same path as the West. By that, I don't mean be insensitive and do not improve the quality of life of your people. 100% you must. You have a huge duty to, because we constitute a sixth of the global population. So if we rise, the rest of the world rises, right? But use this opportunity that history and time have presented to you on a silver platter, according to me, to redefine established notions and come out with a slightly different definition. Find a way to contain consumerism and still satisfy the needs of people. Two, obviously, the nature of geopolitics is such that territorial expansionism is the name of the game in one way or the other. Either you annex or you create a sphere of influence. Either way, you try and create buffer regions. So can Bharat prove to be a militarily strong state which still does not project territorial annexation as part of its aspirations? I have the power, but I will choose not to use it to expand. Instead, I will use it to create a better state, a better society, and a better world. Is there a way that we can send this message across? Three, how do you preserve nature while satisfying your economic needs is one major lesson that we have to learn and share, simply because there's a huge population. If each one of us, we are about 1.4 billion, if each one of us chooses to subscribe to consumerism and subscribes to the yardstick laid by the West, please tell me if Bharat can sustain it or the rest of the world can sustain it. We can't. You won't be able to. These are the broad aspects that I think that Bharat has to learn and share with the rest of the world as part of its journey. And I'm not going to say rise to the top. I'm just saying rise to your full potential. And importantly, find ways of conflict resolution from your own history, from your own thought processes, which you can share with the rest of the world. It's increasingly becoming relevant. Conflict resolution is something that I think both the West and the East, by and large, have failed at. We are in the Southeast. Let's hope that we're able to actually present a via media which allows people to be comfortable with themselves and with others. So existence with the self and coexistence with others. There must be some way of presenting this. Next.
Okay, this one. Sorry, do you want?
Sorry, yes.
Okay,
I was
this
just
one
going through the audience questions only. So Azad Singh is asking for 5 skills that you think a lawyer must possess.
Conceptual clarity in the first place. That is at the heart of it. Most people believe that a lawyer must be fantastic at articulation. I don't think clear articulation is possible without a clear understanding of the concept. So the ability to build an argument through first principles, even when you don't have an example to draw from, and to construct an argument based on pure logic and reason, that's the first skill set. Second, understand that language is not just a means of communication, it is thought in itself. And it's transmission of culture and thought. So at the very least, you must be, according to me, a polyglot. Be comfortable with more than one language. And the good part of being a Bharatiya, who's come from a cosmopolitan city, is that you know at least 3 or 4 languages other than English. I think it's very important. It keeps the mind agile. The wiring is never rigid. and it helps you to access different literature and the thoughts coming from different parts of the world. 3, writing is underrated these days, and I think it's extremely important. When the pen meets the paper is when your logic is tested to its fullest, and your ability to articulate your position and whether you know what you're talking about or are you just faffing around the place becomes evident. Okay, because it's possible during the course of oral submission, so to speak, that you bring to bear your skills of rhetoric, your personal charm and whatnot. But when you write, you can't get away with it. You have to be even more rigorous. So writing is important. 4, diverse reading. You may be a subject matter specialist, but it's important for you to read as widely and as diversely as possible, because you never know what literature can come handy to present what argument. I don't know the nature of practice in the US, but from what I've heard from my counterparts there, they are super specialists. They're hyper specialists. The concept of a generalist in the legal profession in the US is a dying breed, which I think is actually problematic. You must be comfortable with at least 3 or 4 allied areas. So while intellectual property happens to be one of my mainstays, I connect it with arbitration, I connect it with standard contract law, I connect it to the constitution, I connect it with criminal procedure and whatnot. So think of it as a cow that must be in a position to be tied to different trees. Pardon the use of the Indian expression here, but it's important that you know how to read diversely. And finally, of course, I think it is expected of a lawyer to be both socially and politically aware. It is expected, that comes with the territory. That expectation isn't there with an engineer, or let's say, for that matter, a doctor. But when you happen to be in the law, this is certainly a subject that would qualify as a humanities subject. And therefore, it's important for you to be fairly better at history than non-lawyers, fairly better at your understanding of culture than non-lawyers, fairly better at your understanding of politics than non-lawyers. So this is an intangible that goes with the qualification.
Okay. And then the next question we have is from Rohan Aditya. He asks, how do you see India's socio-political fabric evolving over the next decade or so if we assume the BJP continues?
I think all the opportunities that were lost in the coalition era, we will hopefully make up for that lost time and that lost period and those lost decades. And allow me to say this, even if the BJP is replaced, I would only hope that any other party that comes to power is given a clear mandate, that we don't suffer a fractious mandate and the burden of putting up with a coalition government which is pulled at the seams by every stakeholder in different directions. Okay, so anyone who comes to power must be given a resounding clear mandate. We don't have the luxury of let's say experimenting with coalition politics anymore. And having seen the benefits of a clear mandate, which means giving the government an ability to take a decision, what is clear is that policy paralysis is completely avoidable. It's not inevitable. Policy paralysis goes mostly with coalition politics. Okay, because you don't want to take a decision because you don't know which decision might offend which coalition partner, who might pull out. And on matters of national security, on matters of serious importance to our demographic security, so on and so forth, if each of those issues is held hostage by the interest of a coalition partner, I'm sorry to say, it's losing sight to the forest for the trees. So one, I think, is a clear consolidatory position is the way forward. And two, thanks to the person at the top currently, I think it's also going to be heavily person-oriented. So despite having a different system from the United States, it could be pseudo-presidential, wherein it's important for people to vote for the person and not just the party. That may become the way of the future. And three, I would obviously say this without beating around the bush, that perhaps the next 10 years We are in 2023. I'd say at least 7 to 10 years. Thanks to the volatility in the rest of the world and also what's brewing within, there are certainly not easier times ahead, a lot more conflict, and hopefully quite a few legacy issues and civilizational issues that have remained unaddressed deliberately will have to be addressed. And we will have to square up to them, look them in the eye, and answer and deal with them. I see that happening. This will go hand in hand with Bharat's material rise. Okay, so the rise to the top of the economic order for Bharat will also be let's say, a test of its mettle to handle challenges within and outside.
Right. The next question is by Mahitosh Gopal. They're asking, how can someone write history in a neutral way in this era of social media influence, along with the narrow prism of rightists and leftists as terms?
One is, don't kid yourself when you say that you're neutral. If you're neutral, that means you don't know and therefore you choose to stay out of it. But if you know, you will have a bias one way or the other, notwithstanding the forced facade of neutrality and objectivity. So when I wrote the books, and I'll draw only from my experience because I clearly have certain ideological biases which I will never deny or escape or avoid. Be clear about where you stand, but let that not come in the way of consuming or presenting facts. Try and build your case on the basis of facts and see if you can convince the audience of your position, or at least explain your position to the audience. Okay. I'm much more comfortable with someone who has an ideological bias and tries his or her or their best to present their position using facts and logic than someone who presents a facade of neutrality but is ultimately pushing an agenda under the facade of neutrality. That kind of hypocrisy is something that I'm not comfortable with. When you see neutral journalists pushing the agenda of a particular ideology, then you ask yourself, why do you actually present this facade of neutrality? Why do you insult our intelligence? Don't do that. You're demeaning your position by doing so. I don't have a problem with people having a bias at all. And I suspect there was never perhaps a time when there was no ideological bias. The only difference is perhaps people were much more comfortable wearing their ideology and their position on their sleeves and presenting facts. If it was a massacre or a genocide, they came clean about it. Okay. And with time, the unfortunate reality is political correctness, which was meant to filter out hatred, is now being used to filter out facts. There's a difference between filtering out naked hatred and bile for a particular group, but you cannot use it to filter out or pixelate history. What has happened, deal with it. So my guiding lights during the course of the book writing has been primary sources. Cite such stuff which I can defend, even if I'm threatened at the point of the gun, which I know for a fact that I can defend. Okay. You can disagree with the overall arc that I'm presenting, but you certainly cannot disagree with the material which forms the basis of that arc. That's what I've tried to do.
Right.
Okay, and the next question is from Hemant. He says that he strongly believes that the education system must be reformed here in Bharat. And he asks, what can the citizens do in order to bring reforms to the education system, such that our younger generation can understand the value of the culture, tradition, and technology of ancient Bharat?
So perhaps until 2 years ago, I was of the view that the state must change its syllabi and its history curriculum. But I've come to realize that regardless of whichever party is in power, any statist intervention with culture is bound to be heavily politicized, and it's also going to be a creature of compromise, because the politician is less interested in preserving culture and more about maintaining power or holding on to power, regardless of whoever it is. I'm not going to make an exception for any individual on this subject. Okay? Because if this is a civilizational question, then no individual is more important than the civilization itself. much less a politician. Okay. So perhaps we must find ways in which the society has a greater role along with subject matter experts to do two things. One, teach children the value of history, teach children the value of embracing their past, what's and all, with its flaws. Because when you try and airbrush certain aspects of your history, you're basically telling them that they should never have the guts to deal with the truth. And so no lessons will be learned. At the same time, I'm not interested in brushing stuff under the carpet in the interest of preserving this ephemeral or apocryphal peace that we constantly speak of, to prevent people's sentiments from being offended and hurt. A confident society will accept the fact that human evolution is a constant work in progress with multiple trials and errors, and no society was born perfect and no society is perfect. It's always a never-ending goal, because excellence is achievable, perfection is never. It's a statement of vision. So you may have to take a slightly more non-statist approach, or at least a mechanism where experts, the state, and the society come together to evolve a mechanism where all three of them have a say on what is the kind of history that we wish to present, and what is the purpose of presenting that history. So, which is why in our school of thought, we have struck a distinction between Itihasa and Purana. Itihasa is history. So our Mahakavyas, namely Mahabharata and Ramayana, are not myths according to us. They are history. They were historical according to us. Why should I say according to us? They are history, period. Okay? But when you speak of Puranas, they have certain moral goals to achieve. So they are in the realm of myth and legend. So when you see our Itihasas, whether they speak of Sri Ram or they speak of Sri Krishna, all aspects of their nature and character are presented. And the conclusions are for you to draw as to what you make of it. If Sri Rama lies or speaks the untruth, it is presented. If he takes a certain position or a certain decision in war with Vali, that is presented. When Dharmaraj Yudhishthir commits a particular mistake, that is presented. Nothing is glorified. We don't believe in inventing immaculate conception to elevate a particular individual to the status of divinity. Okay? We clearly say this is what it is. So perhaps Itihasic principles and our principles of putting together Itihas have a huge relevance in history debates of the present.
Right. This is a question from my end. I am curious what you think about this. So of course you do come across and factually are very well read, and since you said you like knowing about a wide variety of things, and you love reading, learning languages, things like that. So from a person, like from the position of someone like you, who probably sees things in a certain way, probably knows about a lot of things, probably is happy with some things about the world, unhappy with the others, would you say that ignorance is bliss sometimes?
Frankly, that depends on who you are as a person.
Mm-hmm.
You may need a break once in a while from knowing everything, but it's like a workaholic who can't suffer more than a 3-day vacation, who wants to get back out in the world, back into action. Okay? So I may recede into nothingness for a few moments, just to perhaps calm the voices in my head, thanks to everything that I read. But the fact is, I enjoy the chaos within, because that contributes to the clarity outside. Because that churn is what ultimately gives me the ammunition that I need to deal with what comes my way. And since I am someone who does not run away from a problem or a fight, I constantly need ammunition. So I don't have the luxury of stepping back. It's got less to do with how do you deal with the situation and more to do with who you are as a person. If fundamentally you're comfortable with status quo and you believe chalta hai, chalne do, then there is no amount of external push that will change you as a person unless you've had a personally polarizing experience that kicks you in your back and says, get up. Right? And if you're fundamentally a person who believes in actively engaging through knowledge and with knowledge as your primary means of engagement, then even if you try, you can't take a break for more than a few days at best. You would be pulled back into it. What you need to do is to find your own magic sauce in terms of not suffering an early burnout if you wish to last the long run. Do you want to treat this as a 100 meters dash or sprint, or do you see this as a marathon? Then you pace yourself. Then you change the way you consume, and you change what you consume by saying trash gets out quickly, reels go out, short videos go out. I would prefer to listen to something when it's longer. I prefer to read about 40 to 50 pages at a time of nonfiction. I try to challenge myself in terms of taking up a subject that I think I'm not good at, so that my mind or its wiring within doesn't fit into comfortable grooves and patterns. So the thing is, with time, what happens is lawyers deal less with numbers and more with words. Effectively, a part of your brain is left unused. No wonder Alzheimer's as a condition is much more prevalent among lawyers. Okay, so you try and keep those aspects of your brain or those parts of your brain alive. So be absolutely great at your subject, but also find those subjects outside of your core area of competence, which keep your creative juices alive. That's how I would go about it. And in my profession, what we do is every 7 years, we add an extra specialization to our repertoire of subjects. So intellectual property for the first 7 years, constitution for the next 7 years, without giving up intellectual property and civil commercial litigation. Now securities law is the next 7 years. So that's how you keep adding. That keeps you on your toes, and also it doesn't let your professional graph plateau.
Right. Yes, I think that's a wonderful perspective to go by.
Because we're running a little short on time, we're going to give you guys an opportunity to interact with Mr. Sai Deepak. So everyone here in the Zoom meeting, you guys can raise your hands, and then if you guys have questions, and then we will pick one of you and you can unmute yourself and then ask the question.
I'm comfortable taking questions for another 15 minutes, so don't worry.
I have Diumna Dingari, who is the first one. So if you can unmute yourself. Yeah.
Sure. Thank you. Namaste, Sai Deepak Garu.
Namaste.
So I have a quick question. I don't know if it's a quick question, but what would you say to critics that Bharat pursuing decoloniality is the same as certain political forces in the West or the Middle East taking up decolonial rhetoric, especially when those forces are not very sympathetic to Bharatiya decoloniality?
So any weapon or any tool can be misused. Okay. I'm not going to be drawn into this trap of a question where what happens is we are told, see, look at the impact of decoloniality in other jurisdictions. Why should we go down this path? I'm going to ask myself a simple question. Can I see the evidence and visible impact of the colonial experience on my people and my culture? The answer is a yes. Is it always beneficial? No, it's not. Are there things to learn from the West? 100% yes. Are there aspects of my culture which I would want to bring back on the table and make it contemporarily relevant? The answer is a yes. So let's junk the word decoloniality, because it appears that the word has certain connotations and the word has acquired certain meanings. I have no attachment to the word because it's not my word in the first place. It's not as if I've coined something, as if I have some kind of IP rights over it. I don't need to claim paternity of it. I'm interested in contemporarizing the thought of my civilization and make it more applicable than using Western thought as the barometer or the anvils on the basis of which I judge my worth. As simple as that. You want to call it decoloniality, call it. You want to call it indigeneity, call it whatever you want. As they say, naam mein kya rakha hai, at least as far as the concept is concerned. So I'm more interested in that. See, it's like this. Obviously, the word right wing has acquired certain connotations, right? That's one of the reasons I don't use it at all. I see myself as part of the non-left and specifically as part of the Indic wing or the Bharatiya wing in that sense, right? If at all, there is a wing of sorts. So I am not interested in turning this into an uncivil, mob-ruled movement where you go about pulling structures instead of offering something to replace it with, which is sensible and sustainable. I'm more interested in presenting an alternative which is constructive and which is sustainable and which is consistent with my native thought and my culture than simply creating an atrocity literature and a perpetual victimhood complex. That's the difference between me and a three-letter movement in your country. Okay? My sympathies are always going to be with people who have suffered the colonial experience or the European colonial experience. But if they choose to make victim cards out of it, as opposed to asking themselves, how do they bring themselves up as individuals and as a group? And they're constantly interested in seeing themselves as perpetual victims in all instances, under all circumstances, I am not for it. I am for confident engagement using your ethos. I'm not for, let's say, freeloading in the name of your past. I'm 100% clear about it. So my position on this and my purpose of bringing the decoloniality literature as part of the book was to expose the hypocrisy of the academic left on the subject. To say, how is it that you're so comfortable pushing the victimhood narrative and justifying every atrocity in its name when it comes to certain parts of the world, but when it comes to my country and my civilization, you seem to have a problem with our intention to rid ourselves of colonial shackles and reassert ourselves in a positive way without depending on the West for our sustenance. The movement here is more about self-reliance, not for saying I need reparations which are monetary in nature so that I don't need to work for the rest of my life as a community or as an individual. Right? That's the very clear distinction.
Thank you.
I think next is Satvik Ravi.
Yes, thank you. Jai Shri Ram.
Yeah, Sriram.
Mr. Deepak, I'm also the first sem law student, being a visitor or an audience to your UCC talk in Bangalore. I have two questions to you, not with respect to UCC by any chance, but firstly, if you have any suggestions to make to improve the constitutional framework of Bharat, do you have any suggestions in that aspect as a constitutional law practitioner? Or no? And second question my way is, why do you think being from Tamil Nadu, Andhra, Hyderabad, and several places from the south, you see that there is, I feel at least there is a sort of, let's say, an issue with respect to imposition of Hindi as a language. But whereas we see that the imposition of English is not at all a problem with respect to any southern state. Is it because of the global outreach merely, or do you think there is certain political envisages that go into it?
So on the first question, Satvik, I don't know if you were there as part of the conversation before. I said that I will offer my solutions or my suggestions on the Constitution after I'm done with the book series. I'm still not done yet. Your second question is more specific and much more relevant, so let me answer that. It's a very warped way of thinking where we see Hindi as a colonizing language, and we are comfortable embracing English. So it's proof of our comfort levels with external colonization, but Hindi is internal colonization. Okay. I say this without a doubt. Bharatiya languages other than Hindi have an equal right to preserve their identity. There is no two ways about it. I don't need to be a Hindi loyalist to make this statement, or even a Dravidinist for that matter to make this statement. But the politics of Hindi versus the South has got everything to do with this pernicious ideology called Dravidianism, on which I'm about to write about an 8-part series in the Indian Express, in the backdrop of certain statements made by the scions of Dravidianist parties. So I'm of the conscious view that this is an artificial fight, and it's a motivated fight meant to divide us further on linguistic lines, because linguistic lines actually have ethnicity as their underpinnings. And it has, at a deeper level, the Aryan invasion theory, that pernicious facade and that myth that was pushed by the British and which has been bought lock, stock, and barrel by the early Marxist Communist Academy of Bharat. So I don't believe that we should be having fights on these subjects, because ultimately even economics will play a role. You wish to get more opportunities in the larger parts of the country, then you're bound to learn languages which give you greater access to those opportunities, right? And those people who fight for linguistic chauvinism, they are more than comfortable educating their children in all languages across the world so that they have better economic opportunities by keeping the rest of us down. I really don't see how that works. So I would only request young, educated Bharatiyas to get out of this. Be proud of your mother tongue, be proud of the region you come from, be proud of the culture you come from, but do not stop learning other languages or about other languages at the very least, and other cultures at the very least. It's important for you to learn. The true sign of a Bharatiya is that he or she or they know more than one language, okay, which is apart from their mother tongues. So I would suggest, and I've said this before, that people coming from the north of Vindhyas should learn at least one southern or eastern or western language. Why should this be only about the north versus the south? The east and west are equally important. In fact, the Northeast is constantly ignored and marginalized in our public discourse. So let's learn more about them as well. I think both people from the North and the South should give their egos a pause and learn about the East and the West a bit more, and maybe cultivate humility. That's what I would say.
Okay, the next person I see is Tamanna Basi. If you can unmute yourself.
Great. Jai Hind, sir, first of all. It's a very good day to have a discussion. Happy Navratri. So my question to you is, India or Bharat? So we've been using India as our name for generations to come. And this sudden change to Bharat, how do you justify it? Because people have been...
We have used Bharat. Yeah, go ahead. Make it. I genuinely don't think it makes... I mean, we don't need to worry about it, because people used Madras for generations ever since the Portuguese came in the 1600s, and we changed to Chennai. People used Bombay for generations. We've changed to Mumbai. People used Calcutta for generations. They've come to Kolkata. West Bengal has become Paschim Banga. Orissa has become Odisha. Uttaranchal has become Uttarakhand. So why not India to Bharat? And in native languages, we don't use India. We actually use Bharat. Even in Tamil, it's Bharat. It's not India. Whether it's Telugu, Hindi, Tamil, Bengali, we use Bharat. So this transition, or the so-called transition, is not transition. It's a reversion. It's a reclamation. I'm being told that this transition will cost so much, thousands of crores across the board. Nobody asked those questions when state governments wanted to do it in the name of linguistic and regional chauvinism. And I don't mind paying for this transition, because if it means that I get to use the name that my culture has always given to this land, then I'm happy to actually make the payment. I don't have a problem. Sometimes I think it's important to judge the value of a decision less on its economic cost and more on its commercial, let's say, cultural worth, and what does it represent. It's a generation, it's an investment in the future generation, in the current generation, in fact, which is perhaps the most confused generation and which has very little understanding of Bharatiya history. This reversion couldn't have come at a more opportune time, so I'm extremely happy about it, and I will support it lock, stock, and barrel to the hilt. Next.
Next question from Dr. Sushant Singh.
Thank you, Aryan. Namaste. Sai Deepak ji, and
Namaste.
thank you very much for a wonderful talk. My question is primarily related to the documentation part. So we know like we are going through a very different, a very unique phase now. And we are writing so many things, especially around the history and also our cultural scriptures. So my question is how we can make it like a movement and in a very organized way and consistently, but in our regional languages, because most of the books that we are writing, it's in English, which is important for sure, but in our regional languages, because I'm also in that field. I'm writing in English, but I'm from Bihar, and I'm recently connected with many Buddhists, and my intention is to translate their book they have written from Tibetan to English, now writing back to Hindi, so that the population can be benefited and they should be more aware of.
Sir, first of all, I think it's a fantastic question. I have two levels of responses to it. Please do consider them. First is, I think you're absolutely right that each time we write something in English, we have a duty to try and translate it in as many Bharati languages as possible. That I think is important. But the second important aspect is, one of the reasons that I chose to write in English is one, because unfortunately I'm a product of the Macaulay education structure. That's the language unfortunately I'm most proficient in when it comes to my communication. Second is, it is this English speaking audience that needs to come out of its fascination for the West. Okay. And therefore I'm trying to engage with this audience first, which even takes pride in thinking in English, which has become a badge of honor. Oh, I think in English. Okay. So precisely to communicate with this anglicized so-called perceived elite, it's important for me to communicate in a language that they understand, so that the literature forces them to revisit their preconceived notions of this culture. And from there, they begin their own respective Bharatiya journeys. I'm consciously avoiding the use of the word decolonial journeys, thanks to the connotations of the word now, but Bharatiya journeys, and they work towards understanding their culture, their people, their languages. The hope is to push more and more people into their own respective introspective paths. So I agree with you that we must do this, because what will happen is, if we translate our works into Bharati languages, it could turn out to be an indirect support for the native language publishing ecosystem.
Yeah.
Where then you find more and more people coming forward to produce works which are produced originally in Bharatiya languages.
Yep.
Okay. Here, unfortunately, it's equally a reality that economics plays a huge role. But when you're trying to cater to regional groups, or let's say to sub-regional identities, fortunately, I think there are still some state apparatuses which help you push that particular material, where it's possible for the state to make that investment instead of a private party having to take a hit. It's in areas such as these that I would certainly welcome the existence of the state, because the state has the ability to withstand the shock which comes from a loss-making venture if it believes that it is ultimately in public good. A private party will not have the interest or intention, because it's going to look for return on investment.
Yeah.
Okay. So those aspects of human endeavor or enterprise, which have a cultural bearing and which may not have an economic incentive enough for a private party to step into the picture unless they're interested in philanthropy, it is in those areas that the state must actively step in and say, I will take the hit and I will push this material. Hopefully, when the current government speaks of the national economic policy, the Indianization or the Bharatization of Indian history and whatnot, it should seriously start considering pushing for translation of works in multiple Bharati languages and create an ecosystem. I say this, and I'm not the first person to say this, so I'm not here in a competition for originality. That Bharat must be seen less as a nation state and more as a civilization state, which means when it looks at language, it must compare itself with Europe and not with any particular country in Europe. So translation mechanisms, interpreters, the ability to have a multilingual administrative machinery at the governance level. Each state must at least consider having 2 languages, apart from the, let's say, one primary language and one secondary language, both of them representing 2 different segments of the population. And on a rotating basis, the secondary language can keep changing to represent different parts or different segments, linguistic segments of the state. Right? The reorganization of the states in 1956 on linguistic lines, according to me, is one of the most dastardly decisions ever taken to balkanize Bharatiya culture on linguistic lines. Okay. Prior to that, there were suggestions to divide this country in different, let's say, administrative zones with multiple official languages for each administrative zone, which would have ensured that we would have been much more comfortable with more than one language, and the linguistic chauvinistic barriers in our heads would have been considerably reduced. It is surprising that pre-independent colonial India suffered less from linguistic chauvinism, and post-independent India suffers more from linguistic chauvinism. The Madras presidency didn't have these Telugu, Tamil, Kannada fights as much as Tamil Nadu, Andhra, and other states have today on the issue of language. So maybe it's time to reconsider this. Obviously, it's not possible to reorganize the states on the pre-linguistic lines because these are set positions. But within the existing structure, what you can do is encourage more languages as part of your official language structure, thereby giving more people an opportunity to represent themselves linguistically.
Thank you very much.
Should we make this the final question?
I think we should move on in the interest of time. Yes. So just to end on a light note and also learn more about you as a person in a casual sense, we're going to do a quick rapid fire round before we end the interview. Okay. So let's go with the first question. Just answer the first thing that comes to mind and as quick as possible. A book you'd recommend college students to read?
Catherine Nixie's The Destruction of the Classical World by Christianity.
Okay. Your favorite food?
Palak paneer.
A political leader, dead or alive, that you'd love to interact with?
Tilak. Bal Gangadhar Tilak, Lokmanya Tilak.
Something you'd like to accomplish by the end of your career?
Hopefully write books in Sanskrit about Chardarshanas with as much confidence as P.P. Kane, who authored the history of Dharmashastras.
Favorite movie?
Favorite movie, as a lawyer, it's Anatomy of Murder by Jimmy Stewart, with Jimmy Stewart in it, and that's a fantastic movie if you want to understand trial advocacy. But more than favorite movie, I'd say let's call it a favorite series or serial. B.R. Chopra's Mahabharat and Chandra Prakash Dwivedi's Chanakya.
Okay. That's all we had for the rapid fire round. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks for everyone. Yes, same here. It was an honor getting to interact with you. Thank you to everyone that came. I hope we've all learned something today from Mr. Deepak. And yeah, thanks everyone, and happy Navratri.
So from a Tamilian, Shardiya Navratri ki hardik shubhkamnaएं.